Hello, and welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're the private, nonprofit partner to the National Archives. Through this foundation programming, we're pleased to open the virtual doors of the National Archives and its holdings of more than 15 billion records, objects, films, letters, drawings, photographs, and most importantly, the stories of our nation's past. The National Archives Museum in DC is open and it is packed leading up to July 4th. If you want to stay tuned with everything we've got going on, visit archivesfoundation.org to catch up on what's happening, especially the in-person live programs that we will be planning for July 4th in DC. In fact, right now, if you want to help us grow our network, click that subscribe button and that'll be a great help. We have another history-inspired conversation for you, and this is a live program. Our guests will be taking your questions. Please use the YouTube chat function to drop your questions in. Tonight's conversation is being hosted in collaboration with Made by Us, a national coalition of history sites and cultural institutions committed to connecting young people with history, civics, and the issues they care about to inspire their participation in our democracy. The National Archives Foundation is proudly one of the founding members of this group. The conversation tonight will be led by Program Director of Made by Us, Caroline Klibanoff. Caroline is a public historian who has previously worked at the MIT Museum, Big Tent Nation, the Bridge Alliance, where she developed the Civic Awards, and Pew Research Center. She co-writes a blog with her sisters called Sistery. She holds degrees from Georgetown University and Northeastern University, and originally hails from Atlanta. Caroline, I'm going to turn the whole program over to you. Thank you for hosting, and I know it's going to be a terrific conversation.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks so much for having me and for having all of us here on this panel. I'm delighted to introduce you all watching to my fellow panelists, and just want to acknowledge, National Archives Foundation is one of the founding members of this next gen focus initiative called Made by Us, and that making space for younger people's voices is so critical, especially as, they are the future inheritors of our country. So I'm Caroline. I will be facilitating our great conversation tonight. And I would like to introduce you to a few folks here. So feel free to come on camera, as you're introduced. We have Sydney Courageous, who is on the youth leadership team at the American Battlefield Trust. Hi, Sydney. We have Raina Melvin, who's the community engagement coordinator at the First Americans Museum, a brand new museum in Oklahoma. Hope you can all have a chance to visit. And Nina Nakao, who's the virtual learning coordinator at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. Hi, Nina. And I just want to acknowledge all three of these institutions are Made by Us partners. They have stepped up and said it is so important to be there for the next generation to support their work with learning and civic learning and history context as it's up to them to write the next chapter of United States history. So it's great to have you all here as younger members of the staff at these organizations who are shaping the way we understand history, not only at your institutions, but really throughout your careers, taking these lessons with you. So we're ready to get started. So just to ground us, since we're here with the National Archives, with all of the nation's documents, critical, founding papers. Can you each describe a moment in history or a document that has held particular meaning for you? Whether that's impact it had on your professional life or a way that it moved you and, got you interested in this field in the first place. Love to hear a little bit about what sparked your interest in doing this kind of work. So we'll start with you, Nina.
Okay, thank you. So I actually brought a copy of my document, which now you can't see because my screen. There we go. But this is an exclusion order, and it comes to us from World War II. During World War II, when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, that led to the forced removal and incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans in the United States. And so the document that I showed was one of the 104 exclusion orders that were posted all up and down the west coast of the United States in Japanese neighborhoods, and telling families that they would have on average about a week to pack up their belongings and be forcibly removed from their homes and placed in America's concentration camps. It's just a very powerful document for myself, but also for the teachers that I work with, because of the language, the euphemistic language that it uses, and really understanding kind of like the roots of anti-Asian hate that we're seeing in today's society, and like the swiftness of that moment of democracy and its failures.
Thank you, Nina. Critically important part of history that JANM, that Japanese American National Museum, really does such a good job in sharing. Raina, how about you?
Yeah, very much similar to Nina. Like, I was actually thinking of this question and realizing that for Indigenous people, there's never really one true moment or one true document that got us to where we are now. Oklahoma, prior to statehood, was considered Indian country due to the many removals and treaties that were signed. I myself am part of the Comanche Nation. I'm a citizen of the Comanche Nation. And so, you know, my nation was a very nomadic tribe. And through the treaties that we signed with the US government, we ended up being located in Lawton, Oklahoma. So there's not, for Indigenous people, there's not really just one moment in time. We can look at it in various different ways. We have the land runs that are pretty prominent here in Oklahoma. The assimilation period, which we're learning more and more about boarding schools and their effects on Indigenous communities, both while it happened and also the long-term ramifications of that. So this question truly actually did stump me, because it was just like there wasn't a true one document or one moment in time for Indigenous communities. And that's kind of what we do here at FAM, at First Americans Museum, is we talk about those stories. We talk about how it's a progression. We talk about the resiliency of the Indigenous communities to go from those dark periods of times during treaties and assimilation and removal to being kind of the communities that we have now, and the impact that we still have on the United States, on our own communities, on our own tribal governments. So.
Thank you. And it's a great point, and something I think actually even in, you know, what I would call United States history, there's not one document above all other documents, maybe the Constitution by law. But in fact, if you haven't been tuned into the Civic season, which is happening right now, but we're trying to show a new tradition between Juneteenth and July 4th, where you can take action and learn about all the many stories that shaped the country and the many moments. And, you know, that's inclusive of anniversaries of Title IX, which happened last week, or the Voting Rights Act, or it's Pride Month. There's many different, you know, moments of importance that have shaped the country. So Sydney, what about you? What would you add to the mix there?
Yeah, so same for me. It wasn't one thing, one moment in history, one document that really made me love history. For me, it was actually like the process of earning junior ranger badges, which is something I did all growing up. I did it with my grandparents, my parents, every vacation, going to national parks, and truly just learning them, or learning information by having sort of an end goal, whether it be learning to write a poem or going on different trails and doing more research. I have a shadow box in my room that is just full of junior ranger badges. And through that, it's where all my love of history came from. So it wasn't necessarily one moment, it was just learning, experiencing, and seeing the history.
That's really neat. And I think, you know, about what Raina said also about having your tribal affiliation, you know, that it's an affiliation for you, Sydney, as well, not to the extent of nationhood, but to be with other people who have a similar experience or have a certain, you know, narrative that they're holding in common. It just is an entry point to learning more. So it's great to have you all here. You know, you're all, as I said, helping your institutions do great work in public history, but also I will say, as young people, you're more than your age, but you are part of this vanguard of the next generation that is going to shape our country's future. It's going to shape the world. There's no question. You can see it happening already. So at the same time, we know that there is a challenge to maintain sort of high quality, credible information. That's what institutions are known for. How are your museums a place for information and facts? And how could young people make use of those resources there to become more civically literate, to become more informed? And let's start with Raina at First Americans Museum, which is a new institution, as I said.
Yeah, we opened back in September. So we're coming up on our first year of truly being open. And, you know, we are a museum of new facts for a lot of people. Our history books, we find, don't fully encompass all the stories of the Indigenous communities that we talk about here. So a lot of people don't realize how many removals there were, truly. People don't realize how many treaties there were over the course. There are still people that don't truly understand how Indigenous communities work in the present, how those tribal governments have a sovereignty all to themselves, and how those are impacting our local communities. So we, as an institution, are really honing in on expanding people's knowledge of Indigenous communities, expanding the knowledge that they probably haven't had. You know, we have a lot of older visitors that come in and say that they never even knew about that, taking their Oklahoma history courses. And so what we're doing now with like our school tours and our programs are making sure that that next generation is more aware of how Oklahoma and those Indigenous communities were impacted, and making more of an awareness towards those younger generations.
Anyone want to add to that, Nina?
Yeah, definitely. Just because I really resonate with a lot of what you're saying, Rena. And I think really similarly, JANM, Japanese American National Museum, I think tells also, right, history that most people don't grow up learning about, or at least not like in fullness or with nuance or like in its entirety. And so the ability for our museum to have people telling their own history and like putting their own voice to a history that's not often taught, I think is really, really powerful for a lot of our visitors. I also think just like the archives, like our strength is really our collection and the stories that are told within our collection. And like having something that might like look simple on the outside, but like have this like depth of story, something like a suitcase. But when you think about all of the places that that suitcase has been and the people who owned it and the like lives that they led and how like one thing can like really unpack so much deeper history. That's been a really powerful tool in teaching. And I think that the strength of having such a rich collection and then having a community that really stands very strongly together at JANM has just like ignited this passion. Like we're celebrating our 30th year actually this year, which is a huge deal for us. And we're so grateful to have just like over time had the ability to tell our own story and then to like broaden it each year and make it a more national story and encompass this Asian American, Japanese American story. So like in my role, which is very new, I'm the virtual learning coordinator. So doing virtual visits and kind of really, we're so grateful to Zoom and to the ability of teachers to pivot into distance learning and how much more that expands our reach and how much more we can like supplement that like paragraph in a textbook.
Really seems like the digital age has opened up so many opportunities in that regard. I mean, we're here from 4 different institutions having a panel with the National Archives Foundation, who, you know, is doing great work to get their materials out to a broader public. It's one thing to have all of these documents. It's another thing to find new ways to get those into the hands of the people to use them. Sydney, what do you think? Battlefields, how is that working? How can young people take advantage of that as a learning resource?
Yeah, so although the American Battlefield Trust isn't necessarily a museum, it is a place of information. Our website, so not only do we work to preserve battlefields, but we work to educate. Our website is full of a ton of information on the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, in the Civil War. And we range, just for an example, from 5-minute crash courses videos to articles and details on specific people. And like you guys were saying, stories that aren't necessarily told. And that is something that is so important to me, and especially with the youth. We don't just have articles, we have videos and interactive maps and all of that, because as we're finding, everyone learns differently. And so we're trying to adhere to everybody's learning. And as we preserve more battlefields, that provides more ways for people to learn, because as something I very strongly believe in, seeing, experiencing, being on a battlefield opens way more opportunities and allows you to understand truly how impactful it can be.
And Sydney, you're one of how many on the youth leadership team? It's a big group.
Yeah, there are 14 of us. We're all in high school. Well, now some of us have graduated, actually. But we were all in high school during our year, and all across the country. We have California. I'm from Illinois, but we have a bunch from everywhere.
That's great. I mean, it really is different. And so part of the reason why we all generated this Made by Us project, and it's collaborative, there's 150 institutions that are participating, is because younger people today have different needs than before. Like if you go on Instagram, there are 10,000 sources trying to share the history that we weren't taught in school. And that's very valuable. It's exciting to see that kind of interest. But there's always a question of credibility, and how can institutions like yours step into that role to serve and to answer the call that young people are putting forward for, we want the context, we want the history. And I'll just remind our viewers, first of all, thanks for viewing. And if you have questions as we go for our panelists, just add them in where you're watching on the chat, and we will try to get to them. So do you all have any examples of how your institutions are trying to make history relatable for younger people? I know, Sydney, that's high school power. It's very impressive. Are there things that you are doing in particular that, are new or innovative?
For me, at least, I found the American Battlefield Trust and the Youth Leadership Team by literally reading my brother's U.S. term paper. He was writing about something in the Civil War, and he had cited the American Battlefield Trust, and me being curious, I like to say I fell down a rabbit hole, just one page after another, just totally in love with all of the history. And that's how I found the Youth Leadership Team, which, for those of you who don't know, is a group of high school students from across the country that work to educate and preserve battlefields. So yeah, it's this whole program that is centered around really bringing the youth forward, and especially with civic season, bringing us civic engagement. So.
How about you, Raina? I think there's something cool coming up at FAM.
Yeah, absolutely. We are still growing and still kind of trying to understand what our education programs and what our events are going to even be like. We're, like I said, coming up on the 1-year anniversary, so there's so much growth that can be happening. But we have a lot of exciting things coming down. Right now, we are doing our teen guide program, which is bringing teens in to help with our summer camps and really creating that mentorship between our campers and also our teen guides. Indigenous communities, we see a lot of intergenerational mentorship. It's an important part of an Indigenous community. And so we're really happy to be able to pilot that this summer. But come August, we are also partnering with Rock the Native Vote to do a voter registration event geared towards that 18 to 24-year-old demographic. Oklahoma has the second highest population of voting age within the Indigenous community, next to Alaska. And so it's really trying to get those 18 to 24-year-olds, not just Indigenous 18 to 24-year-olds, but just that entire demographic to come out and vote, and it's really show them that their voting power is so large and so impactful. And so we're happy to be partnering with Rock the Native Vote, which is a grassroots organization that is in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and really working with those community partners to bring that forward.
Thank you. Nina, I saw you starting to add in there. What's happening with Phantom? What's new cooking over there?
those both sound really fantastic. We also at JANM have definitely worked on engaging our community in the voting process, and being used as a polling center, I think, was really inspirational and a great like grounding in our community. And I think JANM is really a part of a larger Little Tokyo community in the neighborhood that we're situated in Los Angeles, which is an incredibly like intergenerational space as well. And JANM events and JANM volunteer groups have always been incredibly intergenerational with tons of young people. And I think that whether they're directly involved or indirectly coming for a school visit, what's really inspired the young people that JANM interacts with has been just like kind of bringing history that's often in black and white to life, and reminding us that like there are so many people that can share their stories with us, that, you know, the history was not that long ago. When we talk about World War II, this experience of students getting to speak with somebody who was their age when they were incarcerated and is now in their 80s or 90s is just incredibly profound and impactful. That first person survivor experience, I think, just can't be overestimated, the impacts that it leaves on a student. And because it brings the history into color, right? But it also really draws strong connections into our present day and the issues that matter to them, and seeing how different generations have responded to really similar predicaments over time, right? And history repeating itself.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. One thing that we found through our work with Made by Us, which is focused on an 18 to 30-year-old audience, is that the sort of traditional way of doing history is, you know, expertise that's held in the institution, and we all staff members decide what we think is important, and then we share that out. And that you can do that all day. Like you can build it, but they won't come. And when it comes to really engaging younger generations, understanding their needs, putting their needs first, understanding that they're not spending every day thinking about history, but they are thinking about right now. So if you're writing an exhibit panel, for example, instead of telling the whole history and at the end you bring it to present day, why not start with what's happening right now, what people are thinking about, and then, you know, connect to the history. So we had a question from our viewers. How do you get students really interested in primary source documents? So do you all have any thoughts in terms of how would you make that type of resource work for, you know, say fellow high school or 20-something age people? How can they connect to that type of primary source document? Anyone can jump in. I will say that last year or during the pandemic, so many historical sites, historical societies started collecting what was happening during the pandemic and collecting reflections on what was happening. And to me, that was a way to show all people, not just young people, you know, whether you like it or not, you are the primary source of this moment. And so preserving what is happening is really important for future generations to learn from. But I don't know if you all have further thoughts. You know, I do think, Sydney, about like the battlefields question. When you're physically present there on a preserved battlefield, that's a primary source as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you can see the primary source, that obviously makes it way more engaging and interesting. But even just explaining to them the impact it had. A lot of the times we learn the facts, these are the numbers, these are the facts, but not this is how it impacted today. A lot of youth want to know about, well, how is this impacting me? If it doesn't impact me, it doesn't necessarily matter. Well, that's the wrong mindset. And that's all about what history is. It's learning from the past. So if you can explain to them how it's impacted them today, how it'll impact the future, I think that has a stronger meaning, and just trying to get them to learn it. If you bring it into your classroom and explain, let's talk about this. What are your questions? Letting students be curious always gets them engaged and gets them excited. My history teacher this year was all about learning on your own, having questions, being curious. He would reward us for doing research outside of school. And I think that's incredible. Just he rewarded our curiosity. And I think that's something that we're forgetting.
Yeah, I actually, I associate well with like what you guys are talking about in terms of the battlefield itself as a primary source, right? One of our exhibitions here at FAM is called Winneco, Life of an Object. Winneco roughly translates to Life of an Object. And in that exhibition, we have objects on long-term loan from the National Museum of the American Indian. And our curatorial department did an amazing job because some of those objects, we knew who originally owned them prior to being acquisitioned. And we were able to reunify them with their current descendants. And so the fact that like primary source documents, the word means a very particular thing, but I think there are primary sources in objects and places that we can really expand on. And so for us, we, our little name cards next to the object talks about how or who the descendants are and how they connect back to the actual object that was owned by their ancestor. And so it brings back that intergenerational aspect that Indigenous communities really have. And so I really resonate with the fact that the battlefield itself is the primary source. The objects we have are primary sources. And really getting the kids and teens and young adults connected to more than just a primary source document. But we also, all of our treaties, all of our orders, removal orders, those are also really important to Native communities because that shows how we got here, how these tribes got to Oklahoma is because of these primary source documents. And there's a lot of power to that in understanding why those documents were created and how they're impacting tribal communities even to this day. So I really resonate with what Sydney said, and also Nina, because she mentioned, the impactfulness of the suitcase and what that actually means to the community itself. And we do a lot of that work here at FAM. Not only do we have objects that are on long-term loan that have been here for, decades, centuries, but also more contemporary pieces of art that are showing that Indigenous communities and Indigenous artists are still thriving even to this day. Like not everything didn't end once we all got to Oklahoma, right? We're still here and we're still impacting our communities, whether that means that you're an elder, whether that means you're someone that's a Gen Zer. We all have an impact in our own communities.
Yeah, the march of history continues, definitely. And I think, it's good you brought up the trees. I know that National Archives and Indigenous Digital Archive have a treaty explorer that helps people explore those treaties digitally. And on the other hand, Nina, I think of you literally holding up, this executive order as your document, which is, you don't need a digital format all the time necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And Janum as well, is a site of history, right? Where we're located, where our founders chose to build our institution is on the land where people were forcibly removed from their homes in Little Tokyo. So starting with the place itself and the choices that have been made by the people who came before us in our own community, and then thinking about the documents, and especially I think the language. When you look closely at a document, there's the visible the legibility of what the poster looks like to many Japanese Americans. The instructions to all person exclusion poster is really something that's really powerful and really recognizable. But when you look even closer at the language that was specifically used to talk about the incarceration and the euphemisms that have just followed us for generations, it really makes you mad, and it makes you understand, like Raina said, how we got here, how these things have followed us, the word choices, and then the actions that came out of those treaties or those removal documents or those executive orders.
Absolutely. So how would you all encourage your fellow young people to get involved, or, to even use their local historical society, historic site, museum as a resource? I mean, I will say when I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, where I didn't know anyone. I had just moved there for graduate school, and you meet people through that, but I was still trying to find my footing. The Cambridge Historical Society was right in my neighborhood, and it became such a great community hub for me, not only to learn about everything happening around me, you know, why was this street named for, and how did this system come to be, and why do they have a crazy, you know, voting system in Cambridge that I learned all about. But it was also a community hub where I could meet other people. And that's like, to me, a dream. You know, could every time you have a civic question or a desire to engage locally, could your first stop be your local historical society or a history museum? So what advice do you have, you know, for other young people to make use of those resources, to know that they're there? And it's a two-way street, obviously, from the institution side, but what would you tell, you know, another young person?
You know, I would just say, like, get involved in the events that your local museum or historical society is holding. Volunteer, that's a really great way in being more civically engaged, is to be part of those events. Be active in the community itself. And a lot of, you know, museums and historical societies and institutions like that, they really play to those communities. We're seeing a lot in terms of museums themselves and being more community engaged rather than being more historical, if that makes sense. It's really getting back into the community and having the community play a bigger part in the museums, in terms of events, in terms of programming. And so young people getting engaged in that way is the best way for museums to move forward, is for us to be able to, you know, talk with them and understand what types of things they would like to do. You know, for our Rock the Native Vote event, we had a focus panel on what Gen Zers actually would like to see in a voter registration event. And so that focus panel really gave us an eye-opening in terms of what types of media to use and to get to that 18 to 24-year-old demographic. What types of, you know, topics do they want to talk about? What types of ways do they engage civically? And that gave us a lot to think about and a lot of ways to actively engage younger communities. Another way we're doing that is also, for this event, we're going to look at different Native American student associations at the local universities and get them to come back and help volunteer for us. Because that's another way to get more Gen Zers or just young adults and teens to be more actively aware, is to be able to talk and converse with volunteers or staff members that are the same age of them as them, that have those same outlooks in their community.
Thank you.
I definitely echo that. And I think that the question of like how, like, what would you say to young people? For thinking back on my own experience, I'm so grateful and fortunate to work for an institution who I feel like my values really align, right? And like when I think about what I value and how I see the world, finding organizations that share those values is a really like powerful moment, and understanding like that you can find like this place within like a very overwhelming world with a lot of extraneous noise, right? But also I think I would say to like to value your own labor and to understand how important your voice is as a young person, and not to necessarily always have to volunteer, right? Your work is really valuable and it should be paid, and it should be something that you hold close to yourself, right? That you don't always give away for free, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because of course there's like volunteering civically, you know, on sporadic basis, being a poll worker, these types of important things. And then there's your day-to-day work that you should be compensated for. And I will say this as someone who works with younger people all the time. Yeah, it is important.
And like, I think it's also like the way that you like sustain yourself being part of a community is like finding ways to like not overextend and to like make sure that you're checking in with yourself and taking care of yourself.
Sydney, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree that getting involved is one of the best things. I mean, I'm 16. Getting involved is the only way that I can express my love for history. I think, most museums or historical societies and just places in your community have opportunities. And that's what you need to look out for. I mean, everything you go to, there's going to be some event, something going on, and that's just how it is. You got to find what you're passionate about, whether it be general history or something very specific, and stick with that love and that passion and go and see what opportunities are available to you. My love of history led me to American Battlefield Trust, led me to the youth leadership team. I mean, I've done some pretty crazy things that if you told me a year ago I was going to do, I definitely wouldn't say, yeah, no, that's me. I've lobbied at Congress. I've written a children's book. These things I did out of passion and love because I looked for that opportunity. And that's what I'd say to somebody my own age or younger. Look for those opportunities and stick with your passions.
That's great. And I know there's at least 150 institutions out there that would love to hear, input from young people and would love for you to come and look at what they have and then write something about it or create something or, make it your own in some way. Are there any, following up on a question that we got from the audience about have you had to read any handwritten documents that require the ability to read cursive writing? I'm sure you've all seen those. There's, great transcription work happening. And in terms of preserving that skill, are there specific skills you think that young people should gain by working in these institutions or should have coming in, or, you would encourage people to pursue?
As for the cursive thing, I never learned how to write my last name in cursive ever. I can write my first name. I have taught myself my last name. It is definitely a really funny thing in my family when we get letters from our grandparents and we can't read them. I think it is so important to learn that, not only for basic life skills, but so that you can read these incredible documents. It is very frustrating as someone who can't read cursive. I'm working on it, but who can't read cursive, to read these incredible documents and still struggle. It's already hard to read it because the language can be very different. But to have another barrier, I think it is important to practice learning and reading firsthand documents. I used to do it. I remember in middle school, they would print out copies of the Constitution and stuff like that, and we practice reading it. But I haven't done that in a long time. And I think it's something that's important for us to do because you need to understand how to read the language and the handwriting and all of that.
Cursive can also be incredibly expressive, I think. I think absolutely we should be making everything as accessible as possible for all ages of people and people with different skill sets. And I think there's tremendous value in there being a typed draft that is more legible, more widely legible. But I think looking at the original, maybe with a comparison document that has what it's saying, I think is really important because you can just, there's a lot of emotion in cursive and there's a lot of attention to detail and time that someone took to really beautify what they're trying to say, the aesthetic value of it.
So my family, we do a lot of genealogy. So this is kind of outside my scope as the learning coordinator at FAM, but so I grew up, reading all of these old documents. And just like Nina said, there is a lot that you can just be able to find just if you can read cursive or even just understanding the vocabulary of the time. You can find out a lot of different information. Onto that is just, you can also kind of understand more about the culture itself. Some people, wrote X because they didn't know how to read or write. And so in that, you can learn about, if you can read old wills and old different census records, you can understand a lot about the community and the culture that was happening at that time. You can understand that people that maybe didn't know how to read and write and only put an X on the line, kind of what they were signing off on. That goes back to a lot of, indigenous communities as well, right? They probably didn't understand truly what those treaties might have meant, or they did the best that they could for the community that they had, for their people. And so understanding those treaties, whether that's because you understand the actual context because you were able to read the physical document itself, goes a long way into understanding that time period and the people that came before you, outside of reading a digitized document that has been written out in layman's terms. Like I said, there's a lot of language that you kind of can read in between the lines if you actually can read in the vocabulary and the writing style of that time.
Yeah, it's really true. And I will say genealogy and family history is a great entry point to starting your journey in working with history institutions. You understand some of the lay of the land, some of the way archival documents work. And as we wrap here, I will just say again, as someone who works with all these institutions and with young people, to not let something like not knowing cursive dissuade you from getting involved. Because I used to, when I was in high school, I used to think I would work in film. And I was like, how can I work in film? What skills do I need? And I read this in a book where they said, the best thing about working in film is no matter what skills you have, they're needed on a film set. And that's true of museums and historic sites. If you're good with numbers, okay, we need you. Like there's accountants, there's people tagging, cataloging. If you're good, if you're passionate about digital access, there's so many ways to get involved. No matter what your special thing is, we need all skills, all hands on deck. So I would encourage everyone watching, tell a young person that you love to check out the local historical society, check out Made by Us. We have tons of opportunities for getting involved and making younger voices heard. If you're in Oklahoma City, visit First Americans Museum. If you're in Los Angeles, visit Japanese American National Museum. If you're probably almost anywhere in the country, you can visit a historic battlefield through the American Battlefield Trust, which preserves them. And I want to thank our panelists for being here today and for your work in museums and helping, usher in this next generation of public history work. It's really important. It is changing. I think, it's improving and expanding access to many different communities. And thanks to the National Archives for having us all here today. So as we wrap up, I'll just once again thank our panelists and hand it back to the National Archives staff. And thanks to all of you for your time and viewing and for the great conversation.